Do people in Gaza feel angry when they listen to their grandparents or who were driven out of their homes to make way for Israel? Yeah, they do. There's also a lot of people in Israel that recognise this cannot go on forever. We cannot just be this tough security state continually at war with the Palestinian neighbours. It has to be about bringing about a ceasefire.
Hello, Jeremy. How are you?
Very well, thank you, and lovely to be here.
Yeah. Well, thank you for coming in. Well, let's speak broadly to start with. Let's talk about your position. So you're calling for a ceasefire.
Yes.
Which is at odds with what the parliamentary party, the Labour parliamentary party, are calling for. They'd like a humanitarian pause. Can you talk to me a little bit about that distinction?
I'm not quite sure what they mean by a humanitarian pause. When Netanyahu's asked about it, he talks about a humanitarian pause for an hour, and no more than that. Others talk about something much longer, and indeed the words first came from the compromise Security Council motion that Brazil put forward. Brazil put forward one calling for a ceasefire. That was objected to by many others. This is a couple of weeks ago. And the compromise was they called for a humanitarian pause without being specific, but that was too much for Israel and the United States. So the United States vetoed it, and that didn't happen. I think what they're talking about is something quite short term, but that means then that it's a humanitarian pause for letting some aid in, possibly some hostages out, one hopes so, and then resume the bombing. Well, that's just not good enough, and what we have to do is stop the bombing. 10,000 people have died, 4,000 children included in that. And a ceasefire has to mean what it says, which is a ceasefire agreed by both sides. Now, those that are making the call for it clearly have some means of communication, probably via Egypt, with Hamas. So there would be a ceasefire, and you can then start some kind of negotiations on what's happening for the future. But crucially, you can get aid in there. Look, I'm getting calls from people in Gaza who are starving. They have no medicine. There are doctors trying to perform operations without anaesthetic. There are thousands of people hanging around in Rafah hoping to get across the border because they have either foreign passports or a connection with people living outside. And I was talking to somebody yesterday whose father had managed to get to Cairo, but only he was allowed out. The rest of his family were told to stay. And so it's a devastating situation on a personal level that people are in. There has to be a ceasefire, and I really cannot understand what it is about the British government and indeed the leadership of the Labour Party. They're not prepared to say, look, ceasefire now in order to protect life.
Well, the argument for that would be that, you had a Hamas representative just last week reveling in repeating the attacks of October 7th, again and again and again.
Look, the attacks on October 7th were evil and wrong in every way and have to be totally condemned, and Hamas have to be totally condemned for doing them. And I was listening to Dr. Mustafa Barghouti this morning on BBC radio, and he was making the point that he is no supporter of Hamas in any way, and I know Dr. Barghouti extremely well. And he said, but you've got to recognise that Hamas didn't come from nowhere. It didn't exist 30 years ago. It didn't exist when the occupation began. It's a product of the occupation.
So why do you think then Bernie Sanders is reticent to call for a ceasefire?
I can't understand why that is the case. I'm disappointed. I hoped that Bernie Sanders would be one of those in the USA that would support the call for a ceasefire. He is a very powerful voice in the Senate and obviously within the Democratic Party, albeit he's an independent senator.
I mean, it's surprising, isn't it? Because you would think that your politics would align on that.
Well, I get along very well with Bernie Sanders. We know each other quite well. We've met many times and talked and so on. And on economic and social justice issues, on power of global corporations and environmental issues, we very much agreed. I am surprised that he's taken this line because in the past he's been quite critical of the huge amount of US military support for Israel, and I hoped that that would continue into recognising the need for a ceasefire. There are many people in the US that are demonstrating in support for ceasefire. Look, are we just going to be spectators? in the killing of thousands and thousands of more people. And in reality, what Netanyahu said yesterday is the truth behind it all. Netanyahu said, in future, we will take control of the security situation in Gaza. I read that as reoccupying Gaza. Now, they already have gone as far south as Gaza City, the Israeli troops. The bombing has obviously gone over the whole of the Gaza Strip. And what I see is a reoccupation, the not so gradual expulsion of the Palestinian population from Gaza, and the creation of a new Gaza Strip in the Sinai. And in 20 years' time, we'll be back here again with exactly the same thing, with Israel claiming its right to defend the Gaza Strip. I hope I'm wrong. I absolutely hope I'm wrong. But unfortunately, all the signs from the Israeli military and the Israeli government move in that direction.
There's a couple of things I want to pick up on there. So when you talked about, are we just going to be spectators on the killing that is going on in the Gaza Strip? I mean, on the flip side of that, the argument against a ceasefire is that we could again be spectators to another attack by Hamas in Israel.
Well, a ceasefire has to be the participation of both sides. It's not that long ago that people in Mossad were saying that there has to be talks between the Israeli government and Hamas. There has to be some way forward. Whether those are happening or not, I don't know, but quite clearly on previous occasions, Operation Cast Lead and other times, there have been agreed ceasefires between Israel and Hamas, and those ceasefires have been brokered by the Egyptian government. 10,000 already dead. 1,400 Israelis already dead. Are we just going to be spectators watching these numbers go up and up and up and continue supplying weapons, arms, and everything else that Israel needs, particularly from the United States, or are we going to play some serious part in this? But I also say that what's being ignored is the situation on the West Bank. Israeli forces have increased their presence on the West Bank. Some villages have been driven away, the whole community driven away. And I phoned Mick Bowman last week. He's a guy from Newcastle who is very passionate about the needs of Palestinian people and walked from Newcastle to Palestine, except the last bit from Turkey when he had to get a plane to go to Amman and then go into the West Bank. And he was at a village in the Hebron Hills. And I said, what's going on there, Mick? He said, well, Israeli army have surrounded the village and are now systematically going house to house and evicting people and throwing them out. And this is all done because the world's media are not watching, because they're only watching what's going on in Gaza.
Right. And so to combat that as well, so let's talk about opening that dialogue with Hamas that you were just speaking about there. You've been calling for this for, the best part of a decade. And if you don't mind me saying, I think you've been ridiculed for it as well on quite a number of occasions. I mean, do you think there's a sense now, do you personally feel vindicated by these calls?
It's not about me personally. It's about the undying demand of a lot of people to bring about peace, and a peace with justice for the Palestinian people. I've been 9 times in Israel, in the West Bank, and in Gaza. And I've been in Jordan, and I've been in Syria, and I've been in Lebanon, and I've been in Egypt. I've visited the undying misery of refugee camps in all of those countries. And the Palestinians who've been 70 years in refugee camps, do they feel angry? Yeah, they do. They do. Do people in Gaza feel angry when they listen to their grandparents or who were driven out of their homes to make way for Israel? Yeah, they do. And if we don't understand that sense of hurt, and also understand the feelings of a lot of people in Israel, yes, they feel a lack of security because of hostility. But there's also a lot of people in Israel that recognize this cannot go on forever. We cannot just be this tough security state continually at war with the Palestinian neighbors. They recognize there has to be a change. So you talk to people in Bethlehem, talk to people in the various human rights groups. They have a very different view. We're not hearing that view on our media.
So do you think that there is, the potential to open a dialogue with Hamas? There would be large swathes of the country here who would be frightened hearing that, right? You've got a proscribed terrorist organisation, and the British government are potentially going to open a conversation with them.
Listen, it's not going to happen tomorrow. a ceasefire would be the first stage of it. There then has to be a dialogue with the people of Gaza, many of whom do not support Hamas. I've been in Gaza and I've talked to people there who absolutely not supporters of Hamas, but live there and recognise that there's been huge problems for them. And so it has to be about bringing about a ceasefire. Otherwise, what happens? We've got 21st century weapons raining down on people's homes, killing them and their children. Their last moment of life for many people will be trying to shelter in a seriously damaged, dangerous building, and a bomb comes down and that's it. Mm-hmm. And that's happened to 10,000 people.
It's possible that the IDF eradicate Hamas and people are allowed to cross back through the Rafah crossing and life begins again in Gaza. I mean, if that is the situation, who's in charge now of Gaza? Who's running the region?
Well, nobody is running Gaza at the moment. Hamas government, I would imagine, hardly exists in the sense of chaos that's there. And the people that I've talked to who've come out of Gaza just said there's complete chaos. There's been riots every time a food truck is seen. There's desperation to get medical care. We've got more water on this table than most Palestinians get for a whole day. That, for a whole day, including washing and everything else. That's the misery of that life that they've got. So I assume the modus operandi for the future has to be more resources for the UN Relief and Works Agency, which is grossly underfunded, in order to continue providing education and healthcare and food supplies. Many people in Gaza rely completely on the UN for their existence and have done their entire life. I've never forgotten the first time I went to Gaza. It would have been in the 90s. I met this woman in her house. She was about the same age as my mother. And I asked her about her life. And she said, we came from what is now Tel Aviv in 1948. And we've lived here ever since. I've relied on the UN all my life. I've got 3 sons. One, I don't know where he is. The other's in prison and the other's gone abroad. And she said, this is our life. We're under occupation. This was before the withdrawal from Gaza. And life is hell. And that was her whole story of her life. Then you think of the equivalent woman of that age in Britain. Be proud of her children, proud of what she'd done, somewhere to live and all that. And it's just that whole life cycle of oppression coming about from the occupation.
The issue there, though, the UN, yes, they do incredible work and they are holding up what is left of the region, but they're not government. So if you are to move into a space where Hamas are hypothetically eradicated, I mean, truly, who? Well,
you have to build up a basis for it through development of local government and all the rest of it. But
how do you do that, though? Is that Western intervention? I mean,
what's the? You have to do it with the support of the people of the place and the area. And the point that Barghouti was making this morning very powerfully was that we continually talk about Gaza as though it's somewhere different from the rest of Palestine and not united with the rest of Palestine. The Israeli border activities have made it very difficult for people to travel between Gaza and the West Bank, and that was the intention behind it. And his view is that there has to be a unity of it. Now, when the last election took place, which is almost 20 years ago now, there was then a election campaign in both Gaza and the West Bank, and I was an observer of that election, both on the West Bank and in Gaza, and the candidates were from all parties. I mean, the dominant parties were Fatah and Hamas. Hamas one on the Gaza Strip, Fatah one on the West Bank.
Do you think it's possible to be critical of Israel without being anti-Semitic?
Absolutely, absolutely. Anti-Semitism is just an evil. Historically, anti-Semitism has been evil, and you read the history of the treatment of Jewish people over centuries. Expulsion from Britain in the 13th century, readmittance to Britain in the 17th century, And that sort of routine anti-Semitic language that's used in literature and in history in this country and all over Europe. And then the anti-Semitism towards Russian Jews when they came to Britain in 1890s, early 1900s. And the first Aliens Act of, I think it was 1906, which was directed against the arrival of Russian Jews into Britain. And then, of course, the growth of anti-Semitism, particularly in France and Germany, and to some extent here. And then, of course, the Nazis and the Holocaust and the 6 million that died. I mean, it is an appalling history, and that's where anti-Semitism leads you to. And so, is it possible to be critical of Israel without being anti-Semitic? Yes, I think it is. Isaac Deutscher, a great writer, Jewish guy who lived in Britain, great writer, particularly of history of the Soviet Union, and a very deep intellectual. I didn't know him. I knew his widow, Tamara, very well. And she was, like him, Jewish. She had deep misgivings about Israel and its behavior, but she was proud to be a Jewish woman who wanted to see an end to all anti-Semitism. There is a whole generation of Jewish people that are critical of Israel's behavior, but nonetheless equally proud to be Jewish people, and so they should be.
See, I hear you speaking like this, and I know you've been an anti-racism campaigner for what your entire life. I mean, you know, you were picketing the South African embassy when the government were calling for Mandela to be hung. But I mean, you know, why do you think there is a feeling that you allowed anti-Semitism to flourish?
I didn't. I do not, did not, will not, never do. And it is awful the way in which people in the Labour Party have been treated on this. When I became leader, there was no system for dealing with egregious cases of racist behaviour within the party. I set one up. I established one. I appointed Baroness Chakrabarti to do an inquiry into anti-Semitism, which she did. She proposed various systems which were acknowledged by the Equality and Human Rights Commission. I also discovered that there was a very strange system in the Labour Party that before the General Secretary and anyone in the head office would take disciplinary action against any party members, it was referred to the leader to decide what should happen. Well, that's simply not right. The leader should not be judge and jury on every case. They can't possibly know the details of every case. They can't possibly know what's going on there. And what I said was there has to be a properly independent system. For those that have actually bothered to read the Equality and Human Rights Commission report, they will see there's an acknowledgement there that the numbers of cases that were being dealt with improved, particularly after Jenny Formby became General Secretary. And it was under Ian McNichol's tutelage that the thing was pretty chaotic. And we were dealing with those cases. Now, we were also under a lot of attack for allegedly allowing anti-Semitism to go on in the party. No, we were not. I do not, and never would. And I think, quite honestly, a lot of that was deeply unfair. And the point I was making was that there were many cases reported which simply were nonsense. There was no case. There was no case.
And there was feeling just there, though, isn't there?
Well, yeah. Where did that feeling come from? Where did it come from? But people who wanted to use that to attack every other policy that I was promoting as leader of the party.
Let's talk a little bit about protests. So you've been very vocal on the pro-Palestinian marches. Obviously, this weekend is going to be apparently a very controversial march, but which is.
Well, I don't see anything controversial about calling for peace on Armistice Day.
Well. That is the line that is delivered by Suella Braverman.
Well,
I mean, what do you think that's coming from? I tell you what, actually, do you know what I'd like to know from you? So you've got this fringe element of these marches, a couple of people who turn up with pro-Hamas signs, and you've got people who have displayed threatening anti-Semitic behaviour on these marches.
They're asked to leave.
And they're arrested. But do you think that there is perhaps a responsibility from the organisers to announce that they do not align themselves with that sentiment?
The organisers have made it very clear what the march is about. It's calling for a ceasefire. The organisers have made that extremely clear. All of the marches have speakers from the Jewish community, from Jewish Voice for Labour, various other groups, Jewish Socialist Group and many others. speak there, and that is always the case. And so I think the responsibility for this really lies with the British government's approach to this, and suddenly dumping down on everybody that's actually calling for a ceasefire, as though somehow or other it's controversial. Surely it's an obvious thing to do.
You can understand the distinction where there was talk of, a potential march through Golders Green, or there was a potential protest outside the Israeli embassy. Can you see the distinction where that would be seen as intimidatory behaviour?
Well, obviously one doesn't want to be intimidatory, but one wants to also be open to all communities to take part in it. There are many, many Jewish people on the marches who take part and speak in them. And this weekend's demonstration, which is now going to be outside the US Embassy in Battersea, or as near as one can get to it, has been negotiated and agreed with the police. The organisers are Palestine Solidarity Campaign and other groups, Stop the War and so on, are very experienced in organising marches and demonstrations. And whilst they might not always agree with the police, they eventually reach some form of operational agreement to ensure the march goes ahead. And they have been very large and very peaceful. Last weekend, Trafalgar Square was as full as I've ever seen it in my life. All the streets around had to be closed to traffic because the number of people that turned up, all at 3 days' notice. There is a real feeling here that people want to see an end to this bombing and the killing and the conflict.
Why don't you think Keir Starmer and his shadow front bench are marching?
I wish they were. You'd have to ask them that question. I can't speculate on what their motives are in it. I just think that the Labour leadership should reflect on the feelings amongst communities all over the country who are desperate to see a ceasefire and desperate to see peace. And the numbers of people that are now extremely angry with their political representatives for not supporting a call for a ceasefire are huge. I went to my nearest mosque to where I live last week, and it was biggest crowd I've ever seen there.
Let's talk a little bit about King's speech yesterday. Easy to forget that happened because it wasn't exactly the most consequential.
No, indeed, the King didn't look that happy reading it out either.
Are you a big fan of King Charles?
He was droning his way through it, shall we say?
Yeah, I mean, he didn't seem too happy to be delivering the news that there'd be new.
Well, I saw him. I'm sure I saw him stumble over those words when the government was basically performing a complete volte-face. Boris Johnson, Theresa May, and to some extent Cameron all claimed to support green values and environmental sustainability. Yeah, well, maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but at least the government signed up to the Paris COP and the Glasgow COP statements and the subsequent ones, and then announced that they're going to invest in new oil and gas exploitation. And Johnson, indeed, after Glasgow, did claim that no British financial institution or bank would ever invest ever again in fossil fuel exploitation. And I asked him to repeat that in Parliament, an intervention I did on him, and he did. But I'm far from convinced that's been the case, or that any regulations have been introduced to do that. So what we're now doing is exploiting new levels of gas and oil. And as Caroline Lucas pointed out yesterday, that gas and oil will be exported on the global market and re-imported to Britain as a finished product, partly because the oil refineries we've got can't cope with the heavy oil that's now going to be coming out of the Rosebank field. And so the crude oil will have to be exported to be refined and be re-imported as petrol or diesel.
Well, it's being pitched as this is our ultimate transition to net zero. We need to be aided.
Well, it seems kind of odd to me that you transition to net zero by exploiting more oil and gas rather than a sustainable environmental system, which is about energy generation from sustainable sources. So it is about solar, wind, wave, and heat pumps and so on. It's all of that. And they're not doing that. They're continuing with this. And then Sunak comes out occasionally with his rather odd phrase about we're at war with the motorist, as though somehow or other any kind of traffic restriction or reconfiguration of our street patterns in favour of pedestrians and cyclists is somehow or other a war with the motorist. Well, it's not actually. It's just a sensible way of trying to make our cities more livable and the air much cleaner. Is it right that in many cities in the world, children before they start primary school have already lost 15% of their lung capacity because of pollution?
Is that right?
Yeah. That's what we're doing to kids. I was it's bad here, but it's worse in other countries as well, particularly India. In Mumbai, Delhi and Kolkata, the pollution levels are utterly appalling, and the levels of asthma and severe respiratory problems for young people are huge. Life expectancy is affected by it. We kill people through pollution. We should think about that.
What did you think about, I mean, having arrived in a gilded carriage and adorned in furs and, all sorts, King Charles announcing that the Conservatives have eased the cost of living crisis?
Yeah. Yes, it seems you couldn't make up a better parody, actually, than this. All those horses coming down Whitehall, the golden coaches and the golden carriages. And there's one carriage that is just there to carry the cap of maintenance and the crown. Well, couldn't they put it in the same one as him? Does it really need its own carriage? And the whole thing is absurd. And the cost of it is phenomenal. It's supposed to have been scaled down to what it was in the past. It was even bigger in the past.
Do you know how much it costs?
No, I don't.
It's about £250,000.
£250,000?
About £250,000 to do the King's speech.
I reckon it's more than that,
Policing and the barricades.
Yeah, you just add up all that police time, add up all the soldiers' time, add up the cost of the horses and all the rest of it. It's a lot of money. It is a lot of money.
A waste of money, you might say.
Well, if we are serious about a more egalitarian and equal society, we need a democracy that also fits in with that. And this is about an elected upper chamber. It is about positive rights for democracy rather than suppression of democracy. And the government's legislation, for example, the anti-BDS legislation, does the very opposite. It gives the Secretary of State the power to decide whether a locally elected representative can express a political opinion on an international matter or not. Well, what kind of world is that? We condemn, quite rightly, authoritarian regimes around the world. We should be a bit more cautious about what we're doing here.
King's speech also gave Starmer the opportunity to walk alongside Sunak, and I think they had a little joke, shared between them.
Did they?
Who was the worst Prime Minister you had to walk next to?
Well, I walked alongside Cameron, David Cameron, Theresa May and Boris Johnson. Theresa May is the most straight. Hello, Jeremy. How are you? Fine, thank you. That's about it. There is no chit-chat. Cameron, you can't stop him yabbering on. Oh, shut up. What's the matter with you? We're just walking for a few minutes from the Commons to the Lords. And Johnson tries to engage in conversation, but as you'd imagine with the sort of butterfly mind that Johnson's got, he never waits for the answer, he moves on to the next thing. The one thing he said to me was, we were walking into the House of Lords chamber one time, he sort of said like this, you'd get rid of this place, wouldn't you? So I just said, well, I'm glad you read my speeches. He said, what would you replace it with? I said, pretty obviously something elected. That could be a problem, couldn't it? I said, what's the matter with you?
I imagine that's not the first time you thought that while speaking to Boris Johnson.
No, he is somebody whose mind is often racing ahead of the subject in hand. That's very generous.
It is very generous, actually. But I do have to ask you, speaking of former mayors of London, are you going to be gracing London with a nomination?
I don't know. See what happens.
Thinking about it.
a lot of people have approached me, so I mean, yes, of course, but what I really want to see is a much more radical alternative to this government. We cannot go forward with the idea of accepting these levels of poverty, these levels of inequality, these levels of injustice in this country or anywhere else. We cannot go on demonizing refugees and asylum seekers, restricting free speech and liberties, and just assume that all is well. We have to be a seriously democratic society, and that means equality of opportunity, proper funding of education, proper quality housing. Those are the issues that I'm absolutely passionate about, and that's what I spend my life doing.
Maybe you've thought about you might have more agency as Mayor of London, different set of budgets.
You sound like all the people I talk to all the time.
I'm sorry. Jeremy Corbyn, thank you very much.
My pleasure.